So in this last minute before we begin, I invite everyone here to start to think about the word transformation and what that might be evoking in you and outwards also in your spheres of action. And this will be our topic of conversation, and feel into what that means for you.
So I'll start opening up as we wind across the hour and just welcome everybody into the room. You're in the Theory U Clubhouse space, and today we're discussing what is the decade of transformation. We have an upcoming global forum in the month of June that's really going to be focusing deep and going into stepping into the decade of transformation. And this is a topic that Otto's been writing about and discussing for a while. And so we wanted to open it up to have Otto kind of share with us how does he define the decade of transformation, and how do we start to think about that, and how do we start to align with it in terms of our intentions and how we want to be developing ourselves. Before we start with Otto, just a reminder that this is a recorded session, and we are going to be putting up the audio on YouTube so that a larger audience that's not yet available to come into Clubhouse can hear and participate with us. So if you wouldn't like your voice to be included in that recording, it's best not to share in this particular room today. But with that, I'd like to open it up to Otto and start us off discussing the decade of transformation.
Thanks, Stefan, and hello, everyone. And thanks for the invite. So, decade of transformation, where does the term come from? So I remember it was sometimes fall last year, I think, sitting in a bunch of meetings with some colleagues from the UN, the United Nations. I think it was the UNDP. And so a term often used there is decade of action. Right, so that's one of the key terms, and what they are referring to with this decade of action is, as you all remember, 2015, and our UN General Assembly adopting the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals, which basically guide the what we try to do. By 2030, right? Kind of in terms of the planetary emergency, what we try to do in terms of abolishing poverty and so on and so forth. So that's basically the framework that we have. And then decade of action really means, okay, the first 5 years forward, right? We fast forward 5 years, 2020, we still haven't really made the progress that we need. So there's 1 decade left. That's the decade of action. That's a little bit the context. And what came to my mind when listening to that is it's really a decade of action is pointing in the right direction, but it should be really called a decade of transformation, because in order to make that happen, we really need a whole bunch of system-wide transformations taking place. And in many ways, we have been kicking the can down the road as long as I'm alive, really, right? So I remember in the, I went to school in the 1970s at the Limits to Growth study by the Club of Rome, and then later I remember there was this kind of report from Jimmy Carter, actually, he gave it's a study, it was called Global 2000, and it's always the same predictions, the same planetary boundaries that we are hitting against, and decade after decade, and then you have the environmental movement, you have other social issue related movements. And it feels like finally we have, and we now know from a climate perspective, this is the decade. We have kind of 1 decade left, right? We need to halve the carbon emissions. We need to reach net zero by 2050. This is the moment where we have been waiting for, and we have been kicking the can down the road for long enough, and this is when it counts. It's that kind of feeling, right? So that's decade of transformation to make these things happen. I would, if you double click on that, and that's maybe kind of the last thing I want to say, I would, at the minimum, think about 3 different types of transformations. Kind of the first one is really transforming our economy, basically from ego to eco, and you could talk more about that, what that means. But then, so that's one dimension, right? But then there's another dimension, because how are we getting there, right? Economic transformation. And that is not going to happen without advancing our democracy, right? And when we talk about advancing democracy, it's really about getting rid of dark money, basically abolishing dark money. And the other main problem that we have in most countries today is the epistemological inequality created by big tech companies like Facebook. And so that needs to be abolished too, right? So epistemological inequality means that this organization knows everything about you, and you know everything, and you can't see what that is. And that knowledge is being sold to their customers in order to manipulate your and collect behavior on the level of the collective. So that's a business model that works for them, but it also ruins democracy and is undermining well-being, both individually and socially. So that's advancing democracy is not only meaning making democracy more distributed, direct, and dialogic, but also addressing these issues, right? Dark money and epistemological inequality through big tech. And it's really interesting, the late struggle there between Apple and Facebook. I think it's moving in an interesting direction where maybe we'll have more agency going forward than we already have now, than we used to. And the last one, the third transformation, in my view, really has to do with reimagine and reshape our learning systems towards integrating towards whole person and whole systems learning, right? Whole person meaning integrating head, heart, and hand, and whole systems really meaning, not only individuals, not only face-to-face or groups, but really looking at the larger ecosystems that in a community or in a region kind of need to work together in order to move the needle in the right direction. When I was young, I experienced the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I was an activist before in the Green and the Peace movement. I saw the Berlin Wall collapsing, the Cold War system ending that defined pretty much of the 20th century. And I was actually co-leading a student group, and we talked with civil rights activists in East Berlin just months before it happened. And it's interesting to see that even the people who are at the front line of that very movement that ended up ending the Cold War and collapsing the Berlin Wall didn't believe the impact it was about to have, right? Didn't believe in that. And so, and I also noticed that in my own disbelief. So that's something I will never forget in my life, right? So I have seen tectonic shifts with my own eyes, but when you really go into the preceding months and years, no one was believing in that, right? So no one thought that was possible, yet it did happen. So that's a little bit, I feel we are in a similar moment right now. So we are in a moment where a tectonic shift needs to happen, yet it isn't quite happened, and no one is quite believing in it. And that, I believe, is the biggest obstacle. So the biggest obstacle for us is not the big tech people. It's not the dark money people, the Koch brothers. The biggest obstacle is the doubt in our own mind. That we doubt that what might be possible right now is actually possible if we step up. I think that's the biggest obstacle.
So, Otto, then how do we begin to address that doubt?
Well, that's really the territory of inner leadership, right? In theory, so it's like kind of these inner voices that we have within ourselves or among ourselves sometimes, and the voice of doubt, the voice of cynicism or hate, and the voice of fear. So I think dealing with them starts with recognizing them, and once you have recognized them, then you're no longer obligated, right, to follow their lead. So you can make a more conscious choice to what degree you want to follow their lead and to what degree you turn your attention in a different direction. And so I think that's really where the leverage point is if you want, it is about bending the beam of our attention back onto ourselves, onto our own inner voices, if you want, right? So, and noticing them as what they are and making more intentional choices.
Thank you, Otto. Just to let everyone know, we're in the room here. We're discussing what is the decade of transformation, and we just had a beautiful framing from Otto. Just to let you know how the program's going to go today, in a few minutes we'll open up to some journaling questions. It will be beginning to bend the beam, as Otto was just saying, and then we'll open it up for open dialogue about how we're each seeing ourselves and our role and what is this decade of transformation for us. Otto and Antoinette have somewhere else to go, and before they do, I wanted to open up for Antoinette to bring in this lens of collective trauma and addressing the structural violence that we see in our society today, and how that ties in with our work around the decade of transformation. So I don't know if that's enough to get you started, Antoinette, if there's a way you can come in there.
Sure, yeah. And thanks all. Thanks, Otto. I'm Antoinette. I'm sitting in Cortland Manor, New York, and really just pleased to be in the conversation with you all. I'm really touched by what Otto just shared, particularly around this moment of disbelief, before a change happens and even afterwards. And I think, when you ask about collective trauma and, structural violence, I think that another moment of that is happening now. It's been in the United States, but also around the world. And I think, we saw that with the George Floyd killing and this moment of really seeing structural violence and really, the fact that we have this technology and can see what's happening. But we also, see the collective trauma that's occurring, and we can begin to sense into that. And I think what's really powerful, we had Thomas Hubel join we hosted a series of dialogues called the Global Activation of Intention and Action, and really interactive spaces to make sense of what was going on in our world and what is going on in our world, and how we can not only bend the beam of observation back on ourselves, but use that as a way to step in towards collective action. And what we experienced is, this moment of collective trauma, by actually looking at the collective trauma and looking at structural violence, we can start to shift our, mode of operation because we're actually seeing it. And often, we talk about this a lot, but, there are two choices that we can make in any one of these moments. We can choose to kind of go absent, we can kind of disassociate from what's going on and kind of go into denial and pretend that it's not happening. Or we can turn towards it and we can see it for what it is and what's really happening in our world and what's really going on. And that can be on a very personal level, or it can be on a structural, economic, political level. And when we do that, then we can operate from a fuller picture of what's actually happening. And, we talked about using shadow as a source of transformation. So really in that moment where it seems the darkest, that there is this kind of gold, this possibility that, you know, we can use that by actually looking at the shadow, by actually being in it, and you know, moving through the pain, healing, and, you know, using that moment to actually see what is in need of regeneration, what is in need of new growth, and move into that. So I think, you know, it's not easy work, but it helps us actually focus on the possibility, and it helps us actually, you know, as we look at the decade of transformation, it's not just like this, you know, kind of like bright green grass, everything's perfect kind of thing, and we're just going to transform and it's going to be wonderful. It's really looking at and being with the pain of it, and then moving from that pain into possibility. And so, you know, that's part of what I feel we're doing all the time right now. Feels like a daily thing, but that feels like what the decade of transformation is about for me, and for many of us. So yeah, and I'm actually hoping to be able to stay for more of the session, just to say I don't need to cram it all into this moment now. But I'm Antoinette, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Antoinette. Just before we jump into some questions of reflection and journaling, I just wanted to bring in Anastasia. I know that she had something coming up for her. Anastasia, are you there?
Oh yeah, sorry. Maybe I think I can speak after our journaling. I think it will be better.
Okay. So with that, we'll turn it over to Rachel to lead us into some journaling. If you're at home and you can get out a notebook or a piece of paper and a pen, and we're going to go into some questions of self-reflection before we open it up for open dialogue. Rachel.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Hello, everyone. This is Rachel. I'm sitting in Rome, Italy, and I would like to invite you now to a moment of stillness. So we're going to take about 30 seconds to just sit with what we've heard from Otto and Antoinette. And after that, I will ask you 3 questions, and you will have 1 minute each for each one to just write down whatever comes up for you regarding the question without thinking too much. So let's just sit for about half a minute and land in our bodies and feel into the idea of transformation and how we approach that and how we're thinking about what we've heard. And breathe. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel the earth below, the sky above, and our connection across the distance. One last breath, and open your eyes. So, what is most alive for you right now after listening to Otto and Antoinette? What's most alive for you? So just put your pen to paper if you have that, or just feel into it with your thoughts and hold the feeling. What's most alive for you right now? Try to bring your sentence to a close. Question number 2. What are the 2 or 3 events that have transformed your life? What are the 2 or 3 events that have transformed your life? It could just be 1 or 2 words, and try to wrap up this part. And now, question number 3 is, in your context, in your world, what is one area that you see needing transformation? In your context, what is the one area that you see needing transformation? Gently wrap up this answer, and we invite you to bring your attention back into the central space as we move into open dialogue and discussion. So if anything came up for you strongly, please do feel free to raise your hand. We will then lift you to the stage, which means you'll be given a mic. And we'd love to hear from you any thoughts that have come up, whether they are related to those questions or not. And meanwhile, I'll hand it back over to you, Stefan, because I think or shall I pass it on directly to Anastasia, who is ready? Are you ready, Anastasia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rachel, so much. And thank you, Stefan and Otto and Antoinette. And thank you, Otto, for your story about Berlin Wall. Because now I'm Anastasia from Russia, from Moscow. I'm a host of Presence Institute in Russia, and now I think the same feelings like you, Ota, in 40 years ago, because now I think something like Berlin Wall is we breaking this wall, and we use I think internet and internet help us. For example, now we can connect with each other, but when we have difficult situation in different countries, for example, now in Russia, now in different countries, we can use another tools to be together. And now, when you speak about your story, when you was young, when you be active, very active, and in that situation, I feel, I think that you speak about me now. And sometimes I can't believe that in one side, we see a very difficult situation, political and economic situation in countries, but another side, I feel a deep connection between people from different countries, and now we can be together without any boundaries. And this is very important for my heart and for my mind, when I can feel that I can be with you, but physically I stay in the different countries, country which have difficult situation now. So I want to say thank you for this opportunity to be together with global community. Maybe this is a technologies which can help us today. This is my feelings now. Thank you. I'm Anastasia from Moscow, from Russia, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Anastasia. Just a reminder for everyone that we're recording this session, and so that we'll be putting it up on YouTube so that a wider audience can listen in, even though they're not able to be on Clubhouse. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand, and we'll bring you up onto the stage and create that space. We're really there's lots of actually kind of messages going on about people who are really interested to hear what's coming up for people around their own transformational journey and our collective decade of transformation that we're kind of all stepping into together. I'm Stephen Day. I'm in New York, and I'm done speaking for now. If there's somebody else who'd like to step forward.
I feel called to comment on the idea of shadow as a moment of reckoning, but also opportunity. And I'm reminded of something I read a while ago, which is, when you're faced with a no, which is an NO, and it's a new opportunity. So pushing through the difficulty, and that is so interesting to me because it reminds me also of the fact that childbirth, for example, is associated to a sort of a physiological pain, and how that can be framed very differently according to how you prepare for it. So I had the very, I had the good chance of coming across some preparation course, and the pain can be perceived, pain can actually trigger different things according to how you frame it. And so actually harnessing the pain as something that will move you forward rather than something that's debilitating is actually very empowering. And I was noticing, in a context where you're surrounded by other women also suffering, just the way to handle pain. And I feel like if I hadn't had that training, I probably would not have been able to get to that space of empowerment. And so I'm reflecting on the importance of also acquiring a certain number of tools and methods, as it were, because what I did learn was, in fact, a method of breathing and of leaning into the pain, which I don't think I could have mastered by myself instinctively, because pain does also, trigger immediate reactions and feelings and emotions. But having been provided with a kind of a toolkit was extremely valuable, and so I'm really grateful for having met with that opportunity. And so I'm thinking of how this can also be true of other situations. And so, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. So how do we navigate transformation in a way that's going to be weaving in the pain and reframing the pain and the difficulty as a way to propel forward? This is Rachel from Rome, and I'm done speaking.
We'll bring up Eva has raised her hand, and then Dayani.
Sorry, was that for me, Stefan? My audio.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Is my audio okay? I'm outdoors.
It's great.
Okay.
Good birds.
Super. So I think part of what's coming up for me in relation to actually what everybody's spoken so far, but if I pick up on your point, Rachel, about learning to be with what's painful, I really feel that another theme in this decade of transformation is around almost a near global reckoning with our colonial past, right? And that connects to the healing that you were talking about, Antoinette, because so much harm was done in our colonial histories. It's really the root of so much of the systemic racism that we see, systemic classism that we don't talk about a lot, but that's there and kind of embedded in our economic systems that hold poverty in place. And I think that as we lean into the future, there is a big piece that we have to take on around reckoning with history, almost relearning history, in order to be able to step into something new and something that's truly transformative. And I think one place where that really connects for me personally, that you mentioned, Otto, is around higher education, because I've spent a lot of my career in universities, and I think what's kind of amazing about universities is that from country to country, they look the same. Like the hierarchical structure of them is really solid, really kind of immovable, and they're also places that perpetuate the dynamics of colonialism, and they're places that are really, really hard to shift. So I'm thinking of several conversations I've had recently with people in very different places in the world who've said, I don't think I can do the work I want to do around societal transformation from within university. I'm people who either have decided to leave or who are on the cusp of. And so I guess I'm sitting with that in my heart as well, around, as places that produce knowledge and disseminate it and train and prepare people for going into the world. Is this a place where we can really address this colonial past and move forward in a way that allows us to collectively transform the systems that we want to see transformed? So I'm Eva, speaking from Montreal, also known as Chuchaga, and I'm done speaking.
Diane, what's coming up for you around the decade of transformation?
Hello. Sorry, I'm Diane. I'm calling from Puerto Rico. And I was moved by Rachel and her comment on giving birth, actually, because that was my answer to the second question, not because of mothering another person, but just because I had to give birth to myself to be the person that I wanted to be, to do the task. So, and that was really painful, more than physically, emotionally. And then when Eva mentions colonialism, we've been going through very weird things here in Puerto Rico, and I can only say that it must be true what Otto says, that the weirder it gets, it's because it's going to change, because it's been so weird and so unbelievable how things are getting, you would say it's getting worse, but then it must be because it's changing. So I have to let go of doubt and keep on working on all the things that we're doing, because I try to read the shadows and these weird things that are happening as manifestations of the change that is coming and the change that needs to come. Thank you. I'm Diane from Puerto Rico, and I am done speaking.
Thank you, Diane. Just for those that are just entering the room, we're discussing the decade of transformation and what that is, and a lot of it has to do in response to the planetary emergency that we're facing and the massive transformations that are needed within our human systems and societies to address the climate crisis that we've created. So for those in the room, we'd love to hear, what is the decade of transformation meaning for you? And what are areas that you feel or are seeing that really need transformation right now? And please raise your hand to speak, and we're excited to hear from you.
Just as people are making the bold decision to raise their hands, I just wanted to say I really loved, Diane, what you just shared, that I had to give birth to myself in order to do the task. And I think that feels like this, when Otto talks about bending the beam of observation back on ourselves, it's this, that it just feels like that quote really beautifully described it. So thanks for sharing. I'm Antoinette. I'm done speaking.
So this is Rachel from Rome, Italy. what I'm seeing right now in my little microcosm as really needing transformation is the school system. So my youngest daughter is now 16 and she's almost finished her her basic schooling, and I'm feeling ambiguous about that because I feel like I'm in a space where I could also not really focus on that part of education, even though I do think it starts with the young people. And the way the pandemic has affected schooling has really brought to the surface and brought home the just the fragility of the schooling system and how learning needs to shift profoundly. So right now she's in the situation where she needs to do one day of virtual learning from home, and then the next day she goes in, and that pattern has been very, very difficult, I think, for her and for her peers to just manage and navigating that. So I do feel like we are now at a threshold where the shift that needs to come into the education system has really become urgent, because digital learning has opened up so much new possibility, and it's also kind of accentuated disconnects and problems. And I think it's the right time now to really frame this. So we often speak about education in a larger sense at the Presidencing Institute, and what does it mean to reinvent university, as you wrote, Otto. But what does it also mean to start with the younger children? How do we redesign a learning space for them on the threshold of this decade of transformation? And there's also one thing I'd like to speak to about the idea of decade of transformation. So as human beings who kind of, we do have an attachment to numbers. So I wonder, what is it, do you think, Otto, that's kind of why is it the fact that we're on the edge of a new decade? Like, why does this sort of accentuate our feeling that this could be the beginning of something new? So that the fact that it's the decade of transformation, not in the middle of a decade, and we like to reason in terms of tens and 20s, I guess. But I wonder whether you can speak to the poignancy of the decade idea. This is Rachel, and I'm done speaking.
Well, let me start with what really resonated with me, Rachel, from what you said earlier, was kind of what you articulated around the pain, and then also Diane commenting on that further. And I think that has a lot of significance somehow for our current moment, because what I heard you describing is really, and it's very applicable, say, to how we deal with COVID and stuff like that. So looking at reality as an enemy that you need to fight, to really embracing it, right? And so you can't transform something if you can't embrace it, right? If you're in the mode of fighting stuff, you're not transforming. You're just kind of extending the old patterns. But if you want to transform something, you need to embrace reality. And so it comes down, it really, for me, comes down to, Antoinette, you were talking about that turning towards and turning away. So you could, so essentially, in every moment in our life, we can make this choice, right? Am I turning towards, or am I turning away from reality? And if you're fighting, or if you're in denial, right? So those are like opposite ends of the spectrum, but they basically do the same, right? Which is reenacting the existing pattern. And if you want to transform, you need to embrace, which is not exactly to totally become one, but sort of you do. So there is like where you connect, where you go into resonance, but then there's also you're holding, right? So when you're holding, so there's an entity that's holding. So it's a little bit of both. So it's between the other two extremes. And how to practice, that's the stance. If we really live in a moment of transformation, that stuff, that's a core competence we need to practice more. So I thought it was really interesting that you learned it in a practice preparing you for giving birth, and then applied that then to other aspects of your life. Somehow that seems significant. With the on your other question, so decade. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm also old enough to have gone through these things a number of times, right? So, like Y2K, whatnot. So I mean, every single moment can be seen as something ending and dying and something wanting to be born. So that's certainly a legitimate perspective that we as human beings can apply to every single moment. You don't need to wait for a decade for that. But I think what the decade does in this case is one, that there is a little bit like a special situation, right? Because if we wreck this planet, there is not a second one, as we all know. So this is the decade that's left. So there's some, you could say, data-based, science-based rationale for framing it this way. It's not just kind of somebody making it up. And then the other piece is, when you talk about a decade, it's not tomorrow. Because if you look at how most organizations actually, when you work with organizations, everyone talks about innovation and radical innovation and so on. But what do you see really going on? It's just modifying the past. I mean, the problem is just most of the time just modifying what is. It's not a radical letting go and totally reimagining and reshaping from nothing. And so the decade, when we're talking about a decade, really invites you to take this larger perspective, right? So sometimes in Presenting Institute, we talk about like 100-year perspective, right? So I always find that a good perspective, right? So what do you do today? What do you want? I mean, 100 years from now, what of that is still significant? So if what you do, what you really care about is not you, it's not even maybe your kids, but like 100 years. So from now, what is it you can do now that could be really helpful then? And so that's a good perspective, but it's maybe a little too long, right? So a decade is really, and we know, if you would live in a time of disruption, what used to happen in a century or two now can happen in a decade or less. I mean, I'm completely convinced about that, and you don't need to just look at technology to have evidence for that. So, well, that's going through my mind on that question, Rachel.
Thank you, Otto. And Leslie, can we invite you to speak?
Hi, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I think it was really good conversation. Thank you for inviting me in. I took note of what was said earlier on, just around, what Otto said in terms of you can't transform something if you can't embrace it. And I believe in it, and I also find it, quite challenging. I was with my class this afternoon, my master's class, and we were just speaking about some of the difficulty in working with our government. And, quite often we need to partner with government to get the support and resources to access certain communities or to work with communities. And one of the mind shifts that I had in the last actually 24 hours is that regardless of who the other systems players are, one needs to remain compassionate. That there is no other, that we are part of the other, if you like. So it is something I'm grappling with. I think, it makes sense intellectually, but, when, how do we embody, sometimes working with what could seem like the enemy in order to get to that point of transformation. I know in Adam Cahane's work, especially his book around collaborating with the enemy, he says that sometimes we need to act, and in acting, sometimes you find points of trust. So I think that's on my mind right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm going to step in to support the moderation, and I've seen Desmond, Lisa, and Giroux come in. So maybe we pass it over to Desmond and then Lisa and Giroux.
Thanks, Antoinette. And if you just confirm that you're hearing me okay.
Yes, thanks, Desmond.
Great. So my comment is in the higher education space. By the time I got my account on Clubhouse, I missed some of the beginning material, but apologies if it overlaps. I'd like to kind of, on the one hand, share a little testimonial of my experience with Theory U and ULab, on the other hand, put out like a questioning, perhaps to yourself, Antoinette, perhaps to Otto more particularly. Testimonial is kind of on two levels. A personal level, I've been following ULab for 3 or 4 years now, more like 4. And I guess reaching out to Antoinette, it's the Gaia experience that really pushed that over the curve in terms of, kind of huge personal value for me and those around me, those that I'm connecting with. And then a testimonial with regard to higher education. I've been called in a sense to as Otto would say, practice rather than preach. So I'm applied some of the Theory U, in fact, kind of a sequence of that in a higher education context. We're trying to fit it into like a classroom model, but like 140 students, 24 hours teaching, and it's the feedback is huge. It's more than 50% of students saying that it's life changing. Another 20% saying that it's substantive value, and 97% saying they'll actually put it in practice. So again, a kind of a testimonial. On the one hand, that it's huge to be a medium for that. On the other hand, I'm conscious that I'm, inverted commas, just a medium for that. That the theory has been prepared by Otto and yourselves and others. And it's on the others, I guess, that is my kind of questioning to Otto and others. In front of me now, I'm digging through and loving Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline. And I've just got through a couple of chapters of Humble Inquiry, Edgar and Peter Shine. And I'm aware that Otto often refers back to those that have inspired him. So I'd be interested in any reaction, about how thoughts and theories develop and deepen over time. And the other kind of space of interest in a testimonial coming back is something that Otto has shared in the past, the notion that he wanted to work outside the system and then found himself inside the system. So I'm looking at the opportunity to, to be program management for something in charge of teaching people project management. And on the one hand, I'm loving the opportunity of being considered for that. On the other hand, I can't imagine anybody doing project management in a linear manner anymore without concepts like Theory U. Any feedback on this notion of it's okay to accept to go inside the system as it is right now, that progress can happen, one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, and perhaps there are opportunities for exponential change when enough people kind of get it. So this is Desmond McGettrick connecting from Paris, and I'm finished speaking.
I wonder, before we bring in the, we now have Lisa, Giraud, and Robert, if there's anyone who's either up on the kind of speaker land, if any of you want to share, or even any in the PI team, or otherwise if you want to share directly on that line of inquiry that Desmond just brought in.
I can kick it off. This is Otto with 2 or 3 points since you were directing some of the comments, Desmond, to me. First off, congratulations on the great work that you shared. That's fantastic. On the inside and the outside, I would say there's this long discussion, right? Can you change the system better from the outside, better from the inside? And the answer eventually is you need both. And and that's also, I enjoy actually most having a combination thereof. And when you go inside the system, what you notice is, when you look a little more closely, is the system doesn't really exist, right? What does exist is this group and that group and one coalition and another one and opportunities, and they're like basically openings, cracks in the old system where something new can begin to flourish around the edges often. So it's much less monolithical than one might have thought from outside. And that's also, I think, true for the whole work of organizational learning, right? So you mentioned both Peter Senge and Ed and Peter Shine and Ed Shine have been very influential for me. Most of what I learned in my work with practical organizations and working, inside the system, actually comes from Ed Shine, right? And particularly his notion of humble inquiry and his notion of really being in a helpful relationship with the people that you work, wherever they are, and being able to let yourself being taught by them and taught by that relationship. And Peter, of course, in co-creating the Organizational Learning Center and the focus, that was what drew me initially here into the Boston area. And the Presencing Institute actually started off, the MIT Learning Center was spun off at some point into something called the Society for Organizational Learning. And that's where the Presencing Institute started. We were basically a project inside the Society for Organizational Learning. And then at some point, one of the funders said, hey, it's time for you. And also from the Society of Organization, they said, hey, it's time for you to set up, an extra entity for that. And but of course, the networks, the relationships, and the work continues to be very deeply related. So with that, maybe back. So inside the system, outside the system. I think that's a question many of us face, and what you see is sometimes it's throughout our biography, sometimes you do one and then the other, and sometimes you have opportunity, like I do myself, with doing part of your work inside and the other part more at the edges or outside of the boundaries of the system. And I'm Otto, and done speaking, and based in the Boston area, Massachusetts.
Thanks, Otto, and thanks, Desmond, for your inquiry. I know that we're just about 6 minutes before the time that we are scheduled to close the room, and just really appreciating what everyone's brought in. I'd like to open the space for Lisa, Giraud, and Robert. So I'll send it over to Lisa first. Lisa, are you there with us? Take yourself off mute. If not, oh,
Hi.
there you go.
Sorry, I'm new to Clubhouse. Thank you. Well, the conversation has woven a bit away from where I've been feeling it, in terms of that the decade of transformation is a call to literally remember, because trauma is in the room, remember the emotional language and skill that hopefully we learned in early childhood. I would love for Otto to go back to the frame in the beginning around the head, the hand, and the heart. I'm part of the School for the Future team. I've appeared in some of the storytelling work. What wasn't said in the video, although it was wonderful, Stefan, and thank you for highlighting our team through me. But in the when I spoke of Otto, that you showed me how when I am at the edge of the system, there's really no edge. So the emotional learning and connection that happens in our first system, which is our family, or in early childhood, leads me to look at, the fact that when children are born into the world, they're entering a healthcare system that is not valuing life of their healthcare workers, the frontline labor and delivery nurses, and the mother and the family, the birth family. I know this firsthand because in my sensing journey, I spoke to a woman I know who is a labor and delivery nurse working at a nonprofit hospital. They've lost 6 nurses on her floor since the pandemic. They were told they could have 1 person step in, but she won't be on the floor for 3 months, I think it was, something ridiculous, and that their productivity is measured in live births, not the 20 weeks of healthcare those nurses are providing to the mother who arrives 20 weeks and on bed rest before her due date. So this system showed me there is no edge. It's all connected, and that systems are people. So it begins with our own healing and our own ability to be with challenging emotions that we can make into constructive, like joy and gratitude and compassion that begins with ourselves, or they can be destructive, like greed and jealousy and anger. So this sense of a healing-centered education, Otto, I would love to know more about your own experience of Rudolf Steiner and Waldorf and head, heart, and hands. This is Lisa. Thank you for listening.
Otto, I'm just thinking before we do, maybe hear some closing words from Otto. Maybe we hear from Giraud and Robert as well. There are so many beautiful threads of this conversation, and it's lucky that we get to meet in this way weekly. But I'll pass it over to Giraud for any next comments.
Thank you, Antoinette. Can you hear me? Because I was having some trouble last time with my microphone. Great.
Yep.
I'll try to be quick because we have so little time, and at the same time, I really appreciate, Lisa, what you brought into the room and the importance of remembering. And that's something that I go back to a lot when I think of looking forward towards our highest future possibility. What is the relationship between that and looking at the past, looking at how present the past is? And you were talking about the presence of trauma in the room. Something that I've been thinking about is how important going to the margins is in Theory U, and what that means really at every scale, and what that means at the scale of ourselves. What are the margins that we tend to avoid going to, that we maybe inch towards and then realize that it's difficult, realize that it's painful, as you were saying, Rachel, and instead of embracing that pain, instead of holding that pain, we shy away because we don't know how to do that. I'm just thinking of, I don't know, in the past few days, a few people have told me about loved ones that they've lost to COVID, and I find myself feeling that I need to reach out to them, that I need to embrace them, share my love, that this is the moment to be present with them, and at the same time that to do so is difficult, it demands so much from me, and so I have to actively catch myself and push myself to go and be present and embrace that pain and sit with it, because my natural instinct is to look away. And I guess I'll share real quick. I'm thinking of, Eva, you talked about decolonization. There's a piece by two academics, Tuck and Yang, called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And in it, what they say is that we use this word to talk about what we need to look at within ourselves, to talk about how we begin to understand systems of power. And at the same time, decolonization refers very specifically to the process of returning land that was stolen to the people that it was stolen from. It refers to making whole in a massive way, and in a way that our society has such a hard time doing. And I just wonder if it's so difficult for us to look at the margins within ourselves and to look at the pain within ourselves, then how do we as a society build that muscle such that we are able to do it at scale, such that we're able to do something like decolonization in the way that it's called for by indigenous people around the world, like in the United States, like on building the racial wealth gap, on building the legacy of centuries of systemic racism, these challenges that we look away from and that are so big. And I wonder how we begin ourselves within PI to train ourselves to do that, to look at the margins. This is Drew, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Jero. Robert, any words from you?
Sure, thank you. This is Robert, calling in from Southern Ontario, where I've had the pleasure of co-hosting a couple of ULabs in Toronto and Hamilton. Yeah, again, Lisa, you must have said there must be something in the water supply, because I'm also going to build off of you. I'll make an observation and then add a question, I guess. So, anyone who's paid any or is a baseball fan understands the issue around a small sample size, and both my cohort of new dads and the folks on Clubhouse that I'm interacting with would constitute a small sample size. Having said that, I feel like I'm noticing an interesting pattern emerge in the way dads are showing up for their young kids. My kiddo's 2.5, and there's a nice story, Otto, over beers we can talk about sometime about how a ULab played into his arrival in the world. Yeah, definitely dads are showing up more for their kids in my social circles, and they're more interested in showing up in the quote-unquote right ways. In Clubhouse in particular, there's a room called Imperfect Parenting, and there's just a real wellspring of parents showing up to acknowledge their imperfection and want to be better parents, to really address that generational trauma passing. And more than once, the mods have taken note of the fact that a lot of men are putting their hands up to come up on stage and share their stories and be vulnerable and ask for help. And it's something that I think is happening more and more. And there's an interesting, I think, opportunity for cross-pollination between, obviously, the work that you're doing, but in some of the other rooms that I'm, to Jerode's point, I've spent a lot of times in places like Black Issues and some other rooms related to decolonization and anti-oppression. And I think there's just an interesting alchemy happening on Clubhouse in particular, where people are thirsty, I think, for the kinds of things that Theory U has to offer. And so my question is really a curiosity to take Lisa's point and go even earlier. Has anyone in the community, either as parents or for young children, been making ULab accessible in that way? in a digestible way for young kids as they're growing up. I just haven't seen it. I might have missed it, but would love to know more about that. Thanks so much. This is Robert, and I'm complete.
Thanks, Robert, so much. And I know that Otto had to go for something at the top of the hour and just, I think, slipped out. So I might take a moment to just close. What I think I'd say is that, you know, there's just so much richness in this. And part of it is, you know, things we'll explore in the continued conversations here on Clubhouse, and also in the Global Forum. I love that many of us here have mentioned ULab and the hubs that we're hosting, and the ways that these threads continue in different regions around the world. And, you know, Desmond, you mentioned something earlier, you know, is it relational? Is it something that, you know, we have in this one-on-one relationship? And we're sort of breaking out of these ideas that things will be linear. And I think, you know, all of what was shared today is this kind of question, this inquiry of how do we move into relationship in a different way with ourselves, with the world around us, with other people, you know. So there's just a lot more to uncover and to heal and to foster these new connections. So thank you all for joining today, and I invite you to continue in your own practice. Just because we don't have more time here today to practice together. But please do continue in your own practice, and I will turn it over to Stefan or Rachel to close us out on today's session.
Hi all. Yeah, just a few announcements as people are exiting the room for today, and some reminders about stuff coming up on the schedule. We are going to be here again every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern here on Clubhouse. And for the next month, we'll probably be continuing in conversations that are related to the decade of transformation and some of these offshoot conversations that are coming up. And a lot of that is gearing up for our global forum, which will be on June 15th and 16th, which will be 2 days really dedicated to investigating both as a global community and in our own personal lives what it means to step into the decade of transformation. And you can learn more about that event by visiting forum.presencing.org. Again, that's forum.presencing.org. And we're going to have more media and stuff coming out on social media about that event. Also, next week on May 27th, there's a very special Gaia Journey event that is pairing with our ULab 2X experience. And it's going to be a chance for 2X teams, which have been accelerating prototypes for societal renewal and transformation, to share their prototypes with you and receive feedback and insight from you about how those prototypes, how you're sensing into them. So that's next Thursday, May 27th. And you can learn more about that event on presencing.org or by visiting the specific Eventbrite listing for it, which would be GaiaJourney.eventbrite.com. Again, that's Gaia, G-A-I-A, journey.eventbrite.com. And that's what's upcoming on the calendar. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for everyone that shared and leaning into this conversation. And we're looking forward to seeing how it continues to emerge. Have a wonderful day. Anything else, Rachel, that you would say to close us out?
No, I join you in thanking everyone for being here, and have a good week. Take care, stay safe, and we hope to see you again next Tuesday. Bye for now.